The island of 22 million people is still struggling. The economic winter in Sri Lanka has still not gone. Last year, it became bankrupt, causing widespread public backlash. Thousands of furious citizens stormed the presidential palace, where former President Gotabaya Rajapaksa fled the country and went to Singapore. He left them at the most difficult time since the country's inception. Fuel shortages, inflation, and the absence of basic commodities became ever present. It was a doomsday scenario, but the crisis is still not over. As the current president, Ranil Wickremesinghe, has warned, if they don't act right, the country would plunge into another political unrest. But how did they get here in the first place? How did a stable Sri Lankan economy stumble like a house of cards? Stick to the end of this video to learn the tale of Sri Lanka's economic crisis, and know what Rajapaksa's public policy decision has to do with all this mess. But before moving forward, we'd like you to subscribe to our channel to support our work. The Growing Sri Lanka. The South Asian country might be economically bleeding, but this wasn't always the case. The end of the Sri Lankan Civil War in 2009 ushered in a new era of peace and stability in the country. The country's growth was decent, growing at an average rate of 5 to 6% per year from 2010 to 2020. And this growth was possible because of the rebuilding of infrastructure. The Civil War had left many parts of the country, especially the north and east, in ruins. So to build new schools, houses, roads, bridges and hospitals, which created job opportunities for the construction sector and ultimately boosted the economy. Another factor that contributed to the fast-paced Sri Lankan growth was the tourism sector. As the law and order improved after defeating the Tamil Tigers and ensuring normalcy, Sri Lankans invited foreigners to their beautiful country. Tourism became a major source of foreign revenue, and the country added billions of dollars to its national exchequer. Sri Lanka was going all guns blazing, and the government decided to open more avenues of growth. It kick-started the services sector, including financial services, telecommunications and IT. In that period, the University of Colombo became a hub for tech students and skilled human resources. And you'll be amazed to know that the services sector almost contributed 55% to the GDP in 2020. That's from 14% in 2014. All was going well for the agricultural sector too. Sri Lanka, known for its high-quality spices, tea, rubber and coconut products, had a high demand in its international markets. Yes, Sri Lanka imported fertilizers and seeds from abroad, but the country still was generating significant revenue in this sector. The entire agricultural sector alleviated poverty in rural areas and created job opportunities. Improved agricultural technology came to the country, and it was an economic boom for Sri Lanka. But you'll argue that if it was all going fun and successful, then why did Sri Lanka plunge into chaos? And here's the catch. This economic development was kind of lopsided because the money that was pouring into the system was funded from heavy amounts of debt. The debt bomb. Well, the idea of post-Civil War reconstruction was a move in the right direction, but the way in which it was executed could possibly be called a huge blunder. To finance this infrastructure development, the government turned to borrowing and took out loans from international financial institutions such as the World Bank and the Asian Development Bank. The debt kept on piling up, which was a double-edged sword, and this meant that once the economic activity halted like it did during COVID, the country would be in for a big catastrophe. And that's exactly what happened, but more on that in a while. Along with the debt blunder, at the end of its civil war in 2009, Sri Lanka chose to focus on providing goods to its domestic market instead of trying to boost foreign trade. This meant its income from exports to other countries remained low, while the bill for imports kept growing. So, on the one hand, the debt was increasing, and on the other side, the import-export gap was ballooning. At the end of 2019, Sri Lanka had 7.6 billion in foreign currency reserves, which dropped to around $250 million when the crisis actually occurred in 2022. The slow poison was being injected into the economy, and a disaster was inevitable. But as the pandemic was about to disrupt the world, prior to that, Sri Lankan president announced big tax cuts, which lost the government income of more than 1.4 billion a year. Tick-tock. Then came COVID-19, a final nail in Sri Lanka's economic coffin. COVID-19, the big blow to the tourism sector. The pandemic completely ravaged Sri Lanka's tourism industry. 2 million tourists were welcomed in 2019 before the virus, bringing in more than $4 billion in foreign cash. But the number died down as strict lockdowns and no air travel meant no revenue for the island. In 2020, there were only 540,000 tourists arriving, and in 2021, there were only 194,000. It was a battering from all ends, and the government panicked. Rajapaksa knew that something had to be done quickly, otherwise a crisis of unimaginable scale might be hovering around. But little did he know that his decision would eventually lead to his political demise. Organic agricultural products. In 2021, Sri Lanka had a massive import-export gap. So the government decided to ban chemical fertilizers to make Sri Lankan farming all organic and lower the import bill. But the agrochemical ban seriously affected the tea and rice production, which led to a crisis that was difficult to overcome. Ultimately, Sri Lanka had to supplement its food stocks from abroad, which made its foreign currency shortage even worse. And the Russian invasion of Ukraine further spoiled the party. Limited supplies of global wheat meant that Sri Lanka had to bear the final brunt. Thus, the fertilizer ban and global grain shortages due to the war in Ukraine made the country more food insecure. And this compelled citizens to wait in long queues for food and fuel supplies. The crisis had finally arrived. Balance of payment crisis. March was the pinnacle of the coming troubling months. Hundreds of protesters stormed into the president's palace demanding resignations. Police tried to calm the situation by implementing a curfew. A state of emergency was declared, which quickly turned into a political crisis when on April 3, 2022, the Sri Lankan cabinet resigned. Trading halted on the stock exchange. The gravity of the situation can be further gauged from the fact that the country's central bank hiked interest rates by a record 700 basis points in a bid to halt the free fall of the Sri Lankan rupee, which plunged more than 35% in a month. But there was no stopping. On the 12th of April 2022, mired in a deep political and economic crisis, Sri Lanka finally announced that it was suspending payments on its $51 billion foreign debt. The default was official. Sri Lanka could no more import or repay its debt. Present discords. A civil war in the making? The IMF has come for the island's help and offered to restructure its debt. But the crisis is still far from over. While the government is working to increase taxes, people are still protesting. Government doctors, university teachers and other workers from ports and the power and petroleum sectors recently held protests demanding the government lower income taxes. More and more officials are now giving resignations. and some analysts believe that the country might again plunge into a civil war, given the political uncertainty. Is recovery possible for Sri Lanka, or is it an impending doom? Well, it's very early to predict the economic destiny of Sri Lanka. The incumbent president, Ranil Wickremesinghe, has already rung alarm bells. He recently said that Sri Lanka's economy could contract by -3.5 or -4% in 2023 after shrinking by 11% last year. But there was also a sign of hope when he said, "From 2024, we will take this economy to positive growth. We are creating a strong country that does not bow down to anyone and is debt-free." Well, the government signed a preliminary agreement with the International Monetary Fund in September for a $2.9 billion program, but has to put its debt on a sustainable path before disbursements can begin. And it all depends on the conclusion of this agreement. Sri Lanka needs to be smart in pursuing its policies to avert another doom. And here's exactly what they need to do to be economically prosperous again. Solutions. First, Sri Lanka needs to overhaul its taxation system to generate revenue. No more tax exemptions must be allowed. The government must enact more transparency-focused rules to allay worries about capital flight. Second, to reduce expenditure, the government must privatise debt-ridden state-owned enterprises. The more it works on reducing the burden, the more it will succeed. Third, Sri Lanka must comply with IMF's terms and conditions and seek help from potential allies like China, India and Japan. A favourable deal could help it to get back on track. Lastly, it needs political stability to make decisions. Without a stable government, it cannot proceed. The economic meltdown was partly the fault of government policies and partly because of the external environment. Years and years of debt resulted in a trap that was difficult to bypass. And then the pandemic destroyed the tourism sector, a major contributor to the Sri Lankan economy. To add insult to injury, the all-organic farming idea completely backfired and led to decline in overall agricultural productivity and food shortages. On top of that, the war in Ukraine further put a strain on the global wheat supply, which in turn affected Sri Lanka too. The government had no idea which hit the panic button, and the result was an economic mayhem. Well, Sri Lanka's recovery would now depend on its wise decision-making. The coming years would define the future of Sri Lanka's economic history. Time will tell. So what do you think about this economic case study? Which reason led to the ultimate fall? Do let us know in the comments. And don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel for more such interesting economic stories.